as a man admitted killing their son and described the murder, which occurred 27 years ago.
St. Joseph, Minnesota is the kind of town where nothing is supposed to happen. Population a few thousand, farmland on every side, a Catholic college up the road, a convenience store on the corner, gravel roads that turn to dust in summer and ice in winter. In October of 1989, it was a place where kids still rode their bikes after dark without anyone thinking twice. That changed in the space of about 4 minutes, on a Sunday night, on a road that led nowhere in particular. This is the story of Jacob Wetterling. 11 years old, gone in an instant, and the 27 years it took to bring him home. October 22nd, 1989. It was just after 9 in the evening. Jacob Wetterling, his younger brother Trevor, and their friend Aaron Larson were riding bikes back from the local convenience store. They'd gone to rent a movie and pick up snacks, the kind of errand that happens in 1,000 small towns on 1,000 ordinary nights. They never made it home. A man wearing a mask stepped out onto the road. He had a gun. He ordered the 3 boys off their bikes and into the ditch, face down, and told them to keep their flashlights off. Then he asked them their ages. He asked Trevor to run into the woods. Trevor did. He asked Aaron to run into the woods. Aaron did. He kept Jacob. By the time the other 2 boys worked up the courage to come back out of the trees, the road was empty. No bike, no masked man, no Jacob. Think about how fast that is. 4 minutes, maybe less, long enough to ask 3 names, 3 ages, and make a choice. Not long enough for a scream to carry to the nearest house, or for a passing car to notice anything wrong. St. Joseph is a town built on the assumption that a rural road at 9 at night is safe simply because it always has been. That assumption didn't just fail Jacob Wetterling that night, it failed an entire region's sense of itself, and it would take decades to understand exactly how deep that failure went. Trevor ran to a nearby house and called their parents. Within minutes, Jerry and Patty Wetterling were in their car, driving the half-mile stretch of road between their home and the store, searching a stretch of gravel that suddenly felt endless. Local police arrived. Then county sheriff's deputies. Then, within hours, the FBI. At the scene, investigators found something concrete. Tire tracks pressed into the dirt, later identified as a specific brand of tire, and a shoe print in the mud nearby. It felt, in the first hours, like the kind of evidence that solves a case fast. It would take 27 years to find out how wrong that feeling was. What happened next is one of the largest missing child searches in American history. Within days, deputies on horseback combed the fields around St. Joseph. Then came the National Guard, over 200 troops, eventually assigned to the search, along with dozens of workers from the state's Department of Natural Resources, scouring roughly 700 square miles of central Minnesota. Search parties walked shoulder to shoulder through cornfields already cut down for the season, through ditches, through wooded lots that hadn't been touched by human feet in years. Nothing. The Wetterlings made a decision early on that would define the rest of their lives. They chose to be loud. Loud, public, relentless. They went on national television. They gave interviews to any outlet that would have them. A community fund quickly gathered a 6-figure reward for information, leading to Jacob's safe return. Thousands of tips poured in from around the country after the story ran on national television. Investigators would later say they interviewed literally thousands of people in the following year alone. And still, nothing solid. No confirmed sighting. No body, no answers. Some of those tips were well-meaning and useless. Some were cruel people calling in false confessions or fabricated sightings just to insert themselves into a national story. Investigators had to run each one down anyway because the alternative was ignoring the one call that might actually matter. That's the quiet, grinding reality behind almost every high-profile missing child case. For every hour of searchlights and helicopters that makes the evening news, there are 100 hours of officers sitting across a table from a stranger, writing down a story that goes nowhere. Winter came to central Minnesota that year the way it always does, early, hard, and without any regard for an active search. Snow buried whatever evidence might have still been sitting exposed in the fields and ditches around St. Joseph. By the time spring thawed the ground again, the case had already begun the slow transformation from breaking news into a story people in Minnesota simply knew by heart. The way you know the outline of a family tragedy that happened a few towns over from where you grew up. There was, however, one thread that seemed to matter from the very beginning, and it led backward in time to a boy in a nearby town named Cold Spring. 9 months before Jacob was taken, in January of 1989, a 12-year-old boy named Jared Shile was walking home from a cafe in Cold Spring, Minnesota, a town not far from St. Joseph. A man in a car approached him, forced him inside, drove him to a secluded spot, and sexually assaulted him before letting him go, warning him not to look back or he'd be shot. When investigators compared notes after Jacob's abduction, the parallels were hard to ignore. A quiet rural road, a stranger who threatened to shoot if the boy looked back, a calm, practiced menace in the way he spoke. Law enforcement suspected early on that the same man was behind both crimes. It would take over 2.5 decades to prove they were right, and to learn that the survivor of that earlier assault, Jared Shile, would end up playing an unexpected role in finally closing the case. For now, though, in the fall of 1989, all investigators had was a theory, a composite sketch released to the public in December, and a flood of tips that led nowhere definitive. What makes the Cold Spring connection so haunting in hindsight is how close it came to being the key that unlocked everything, years before it actually did. A survivor had looked his attacker in the eye, or close to it, and lived to describe him. He'd heard the man's voice, felt the texture of his fear, absorbed details that no crime scene technician could have lifted from a tire track. That kind of testimony is gold in an investigation, and yet, for reasons that speak to how disconnected different jurisdictions and case files could be in that era, the full weight of that connection wasn't pieced together into an actionable lead for another 25 years. Cases like this don't stay front-page news forever. But this one never fully left the public consciousness in Minnesota, largely because Jacob's parents refused to let it. In 1990, Patty and Jerry Wetterling founded the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, an organization built to help other families deal with child abduction and to push for better protections for kids. Patty Wetterling became one of the most recognizable advocates for missing children in the country, testifying before Congress, working with law enforcement nationally, turning unbearable grief into policy. That work had teeth. In 1994, Congress passed what became known as the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act legislation that pushed states to create sex offender registries. It's a piece of the modern legal landscape most Americans now take for granted, and it exists in large part because one family refused to let their son's case fade into a cold case file. Patty Wetterling later ran for Congress twice, in 2004 and 2006, losing both races, but never entirely stepping out of public life. Through all of it, the campaigns, the advocacy, the interviews, there was no funeral, no grave, no confirmed answer about what had happened to Jacob on that road. Investigators, meanwhile, kept working the case in fits and starts. Tips came in for years, decades even. In 2010, more than 20 years after the abduction, authorities spent 2 days digging at a farm property near the abduction site after a new lead suggested it might hold evidence. Forensic testing on what they found came back negative. No connection to the crime. It was one more dead end in a case that had accumulated hundreds of them. But there was a name that kept resurfacing in the file, over and over, going back almost to the beginning. Danny Heinrich. Danny Heinrich lived in Paynesville, Minnesota, a town near both St. Joseph and Cold Spring. He'd been on investigators' radar since close to the start. He'd worked at a distribution warehouse a few miles from where Jacob was taken and had lost that job just 2 weeks before the abduction. People who knew him, including members of his own family, described him in early interviews as a loner. An investigator working the case in the early 1990s reportedly flagged Heinrich as someone worth a closer look, describing a theory that the abductor might be a solitary construction or warehouse worker in the area. But in a case drowning in tips and suspects, that thread reportedly didn't get pulled as hard as it might have. Heinrich was interviewed. He denied involvement. And for years, the case moved on to other leads, other names, other dead ends. The physical evidence from the scene, that tire track, that shoe print, never conclusively tied back to him. Forensic technology in 1989 simply couldn't make the kind of precise match that later decades of DNA science would allow. Heinrich stayed a name in a file, not a suspect in cuffs. That began to change in 2014, when the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, a unit built specifically to bring fresh eyes to cold child abduction cases, took another pass at the entire Wetterling file from the ground up. They didn't just look at Jacob's case. They looked at Cold Spring. They looked at a string of similar unsolved assaults on boys in the surrounding area throughout the late 1980s. And Danny Heinrich's name came back up, this time with modern investigative tools behind it. The break, when it finally came, arrived sideways. In October of 2015, federal authorities arrested Danny Heinrich not for Jacob's abduction, but on charges related to child pornography. Investigators had built a case around images found in his possession, and it was that separate federal prosecution that gave law enforcement the legal leverage they'd never had before. Publicly, authorities named Heinrich a person of interest in the Wetterling case. Heinrich, through his attorneys, denied any involvement in Jacob's disappearance. For months, the case sat in that uncomfortable space, a strong suspicion, a serious federal charge on unrelated grounds. And still no confession, no remains, no closure. Behind the scenes, though, prosecutors were negotiating. And that's where the case took its final strange turn. A plea deal, not for Jacob's murder, but built around the federal child pornography charges, one that the Wetterling family itself agreed to. In exchange for a plea on those charges, Heinrich would tell the truth about what happened to Jacob and show investigators exactly where his remains could be found. It's an outcome that still unsettles people who followed the case. A confessed killer who was never formally charged with that killing, because the physical evidence tying him to the scene had degraded past the point of a certain conviction, and because the Wetterlings themselves ultimately decided that finding their son mattered more than a murder charge that might not hold up in court. On September 1st, 2016, acting on information from the plea agreement, investigators went to a rural property near Paynesville, Minnesota. They began to dig. 2 days later, on September 3rd, authorities confirmed what the Wetterling family had waited 27 years to hear and had almost certainly known in their hearts for a very long time. They had found remains, and they belonged to Jacob. Among what was recovered was a red hockey jacket, a St. Cloud youth hockey jacket, the same one Jacob had been wearing the night he disappeared. For the lead federal prosecutor on the case, that jacket was the moment everything became real. He would later describe it as a moment he'd never forget, the instant that confirmed, beyond any remaining doubt, that Heinrich had been telling the truth about where he'd buried the boy. 3 days after that, on September 6th, Danny Heinrich stood in a federal courtroom in Minneapolis and did something no one had managed to make happen in 27 years of searching. He confessed. Not in a police interrogation room. Not in a whispered plea deal document. In open court, as part of his guilty plea on the federal pornography charges, Heinrich described in detail what he had done. He said he'd abducted Jacob, sexually assaulted him, and shot him. He said he'd buried the body near a gravel pit not far from where he'd taken him. He also confessed in that same hearing to the assault of Jared Scheil in Cold Spring 9 months earlier, confirming what investigators had suspected from nearly the very beginning, that the same man was responsible for both crimes. Jared Scheil was in that courtroom. So was Patty Wetterling. So was Jerry. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, the family didn't have to wonder. They had an answer, even if it was the answer they had spent half their lives hoping they'd never hear. There's something almost unbearably ordinary about how the confession actually unfolded. No dramatic standoff, no last-minute twist. Just a man in a courtroom reading from a plea agreement, describing the worst thing he had ever done in the flat, procedural language that criminal court requires. Because of the plea agreement, Danny Heinrich was never charged with Jacob's murder. He pleaded guilty only to the federal child pornography charges, receiving a 20-year sentence on those counts. thousands of investigators, one determined family, and one unrelated federal charge to finally close. It's not the ending anyone wanted for him. But for a case that spent nearly 3 decades as an open wound in the middle of the country, it was, at last, an ending.